How many people have had this done?
Depends on what. I don't think we have exact numbers, but if we're talking about the drugs, it's millions.
You're talking about hormone blockers.
Yeah,
Millions of kids have been on hormone blockers. Really?
I'm sure someone's going to fact check me on it, but my guess is that we're into the millions now at this point. Yeah, that would be my guess. That this shouldn't be happening to.
It's a very small number, if that's right.
It says over the last 5 years, there were at least 4,780 adolescents who started puberty blockers and had a prior gender dysphoria diagnosis.
This says it's kind of undercounted, but that
would be a big undercounting.
Less than 1,000 people a year.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would guess, hundreds of thousands at this, but I could be wrong.
Million sounds great.
Yeah, I could be wrong.
Yeah.
The Media Matters will have fun with that clip.
Yeah.
Yeah, now, yeah.
All right. I am now joined by Matt McManus, lecturer in political science at the University of Michigan, regular Jacobin contributor, Mad About Town. And we are here to talk about one of the voices you just heard, Matt Walsh, who Matt just wrote an article about, and I just had the wrong article, but where's the right article? There we go. Matt Walsh's vitriolic anti-trans Christianity is distinctly anti-Christian. So I want to get into that in a minute, but we do have a few other things we want to get to. First, how are you doing, Matt?
I'm doing really well, actually. I mean, the weather is beautiful. The beer in my fridge is cold, and it looks like I'm going to have a little vacation where I go to a buddy's cottage at the end of the month. So no complaints on my part.
Nice.
Buddy's friend's parents' cottage, to be clear. He doesn't own it, but close enough.
Yeah, I am not sitting in front of a green screen right now because I'm in the middle of moving apartments. But I could, I don't know, maybe the virtual green screen would work anyway, but whatever, you get my kitchen. But yeah, life is good. And, Matt Walsh's existence is only a mild stain on it, but I want to get back to that in a minute. Before that, I want to talk about a couple of other things. One of them is an article, the subject of an article that I just wrote for Jacobin about. It's called "School Lunchette" is a phrase that should exist in a humane society, and what it's about is this bill. Yeah. So Bernie Sanders, Ilhan Omar, and a bunch of other people just introduced this bill called the Universal School Meals Program Act of 2023, which would revise something that existed during the pandemic that was discontinued back in fall of the last year, 2022, which was that for a year or two there, we were actually providing meals at school to children without charging them anything or scrutinizing their parents' bank accounts to make sure that these particular children really, really needed and that their parents couldn't pay, but just like, hey, all right, here's the lunch. And the thing that really caught my attention about that, when I started reading about this, the description of the bill was this phrase, one of the things it would do, provide these free meals, do this, do that, abolish all school meal debt. Oh my God, school.
Yeah, I mean, the minute you hear that phrase, there's something about it that turns over in your mind, right? Where you're like, that exists? Nobody thinks this is a moral travesty? God, aren't we fallen as a species?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, what we're about to hear is an extreme example of one particular school district, but this is a story I found from a few years ago, before the original program was instituted during the pandemic.
This one-page letter sent to about 1,000 parents in the Wyoming Valley West School District is at the center of a very intense debate and growing controversy. Some say the letter's heavy-handed. Is it heavy-handed? Threatening?
I wouldn't say it's threatening.
So says attorney Charles Coslett, the solicitor for the Valley West School District. Now, the letter informs the parents that the unpaid lunch bills can result in them being taken to dependency court and possibly their child being removed from their home and placed into foster care for basically not providing food for their child. But Coslett insists it is only one of the options, legal options, open to the district.
Hopefully that gets their attention. Certainly did, didn't it? I mean, if you think about it, you're here this morning because some parent's crying foul over he or she doesn't want to pay a debt.
Jesus Christ. It kind of reminds me of that old Carlin sketch about conservatives, right? And it's actually a nice segue to Matt Walsh, because if you have a kid and they're unborn, or if you have a kid and they want to get trans, and all of a sudden, they're Helen Ludgeboy, won't someone please think of the children? But the minute that somebody is like, we should get taxpayer-funded lunches, they're like, you're on your fucking own, right? Deal with it yourself. What are you doing asking me to provide crackers and cheese to your kids? Fuck off.
I mean, this is this is kind of an incredible thing I mean, when I was writing the article, I wanted to see what the opposition looked like, and I found a Heritage Foundation paper from when the original pandemic era one was instituted, where they said that, well, this is objectionable because it provides welfare to children who don't even need it because their parents could afford to pay, and it quotes Milton Friedman, who said there's nothing so temporary, permanent as a temporary government program, which sadly in this case turned out not to be true. But I mean, it is. I suppose it is true that if a program is instituted and people find out it works really well and it makes people's lives better, there is danger that it will then be hard to take away.
Oh, yeah. And sometimes people can be really overt about this. I remember a Wall Street Journal article from 2020 that was talking about giving payments to people in order to stay home. And it was one of the most sinister, classist things I've ever read, because it really shows you that they can be contemplative about this to a level that we wouldn't have really thought, where they're like, yeah, we understand that there's an economic motivation and necessity for this at this point, but we can't be giving people too much free money, because then they might realize that this can be done long term, and they might realize that they actually like it, and this might lead to calls for something like UBI. So got to make sure that it's really, really transient. But what's obscene about this, and I really want to stress...
Nightmare.
Sorry, go ahead.
Thank God we avoided that nightmare.
Yeah, thank God we got avoided that nightmare of fucking low-income people having enough money to put their kids through school. But what's baffling about this to me is that this is nominally supposed to be the richest country in the world, right? I constantly hear that everywhere I go. And yet, if you were to go to India and you were to bring your child to a school, you would make sure you would know that your kid would get a free lunch when they went there. One of the poorest states in India, Kerala, in the 1990s, instituted a school lunch program that really kicked into gear in the 2000s. It was particularly aimed at women because they really wanted to get women, or girls really, out of the factory system and into education. And now Kerala is one of the richest states in the country. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that it has one of the most educated populations. And my feeling is, if you can have a big country like India provide school lunches to their kids, there's no argument for not doing that in the United States, when there is apparently so many billionaires that we can have somebody with $3 billion moored in Florida with a fucking yacht called the Fountainhead.
It's a beautiful detail. So I want to I do want to transition to Matt Walsh, who is, of course, best known, I think, for this for his movie and accompanying book.
I mean, you say that. I know him best for his deep ruminations on whether or not there could be a black mermaid, the kind of thing that occupies the great minds on the right now. We really have to probe into this question, right? I mean, do you think it is scientifically possible for there to be a black mermaid? I'm just asking questions. It's important to inquire into these kinds of things. It's not that you're opposed to the idea of a black mermaid. It's just that we want to be scientifically accurate about mermaids and mermaidism.
I will say, actually, now that you broached that, I'm not about to offer a take about whether there could be black mermaids, that I do find it sort of fascinating. This is going to seem off topic, but it's going back in a minute. Did you catch after Tucker Carlson was fired that text message exchange that came out where he was talking about like some MAGA people like jumping in the Antifa kid? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I mean, there were so many of those. It rings a bell from something I read on like CNN or whatever. But yeah, remind me.
Okay, so Carlson is texting, I don't know, his producer maybe. He's texting somebody, and that like such text messages could come out in discovery for a lawsuit, and this became public after he was fired, and it was kind of funny because it was like almost humanizing for the most part if you ignore one big turn in the punch bowl. So again, the overall point of the text messages was he was watching the video of some MAGA people, like, I don't know, they like getting into a fight with this Antifa kid, and they like ganged up on him and they were hitting him, and he said he had this moment where he felt himself like relishing, the violence, and then
that's right, yeah.
And then he like pulls back. And he feels really bad about it because this is a human being, and there's somebody who loves this kid, he has parents, brothers and sisters and all that stuff. Stop there and think, oh man, okay, Tucker had a very human moment there. But in his expression of what exactly was wrong with what he saw, he said, "This is not how white men fight."
So it's like, I don't know, is that 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back? It's something that we can debate philosophically, right? I mean, don't get me wrong. I reviewed a collection of Tucker's essays for Arc Digital a long time ago. Very critical review, obviously. And what became really clear when I was reading them is that he is definitely a grifter in the sense that he's play acting a role. Because what was interesting is reading some of his stuff from the 1990s, he wasn't a bad journalist, just from a purely technical standpoint, right? Obviously, his ideological convictions were always repellent, but like he could be reflective, say some critical things about George Bush when he pointed out that the distinction between like Bush's presentation and his real motivations was completely out of sync. It was a pretty interesting article, actually. Flash forward to like 2016, which was when the book, the moment the book was kind of commenting on, and like he's just spouting the very routine MAGA line, yada yada elites, yada yada this, right?
Yeah, well, and also those text messages. There's a oh my God, I hate Trump so much. I'm so sick of having to defend this idiot, which I think tells you what he thinks about the audience. But
definitely,
100% with you on the role he's played. But yeah, that is an interesting revelation of his inner thoughts, and the reason the way it comes back to bear on Matt Walsh is that I saw this clip of Walsh like responding to people raising their eyebrows, this is not how men fight, and by saying, well, I mean, what is Tucker saying that's wrong? It's I mean, every time I ever see a video of like a bunch of guys like ganging up on one person and beating him up, it's never white guys doing it, which the thought this might say more about which videos Matt Walsh is consuming, and doesn't seem to cross his mind, but like it's like, so this is just a statement of fact, this is not how white men fight. And I found it really interesting because, like, man, like, okay, Matt Walsh just cannot wait. If there's a way to like pry open, the Overton window, another quarter of which towards like more openly acceptable racism. It's like we're gonna seize it with both hands.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, people talk about dog whistles. Some of these people have a fucking blowhorn that they're just like wah, 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 to their audience, right? And Tucker fell squarely within that category. I don't even know how to categorize Walsh because his homophobia and transphobia is so fig-leafed that it's almost remarkable. Like, especially if you read his books or watch anything he's done. Like, he'll sit there and be like, I am not transphobic in a certain sense. I love trans people. I love all people because God commands us to do so. But like the groomers and the pedophiles and yada, yada, yada are all coming to take your kids away. And we need extreme action in order to stop them because, our country is going to hell. And actually, now that I reflect upon it, the Bible does call upon us to love, but it also calls upon us to hate. And maybe we need a little more hatred in our love also. It's like, gotcha, Matt. Reading you loud and clear.
That takes us to his new book, which is what you're reviewing. And I do want to hear about it just a minute. But first, I did want to say, okay, Matt Walsh is probably best known for his thoughts about the trans issue and perhaps to some extent his thoughts about the Black Mermaid issue. But I did see...
And about the fertility rates of teenage girls, let's be clear, right? It's a very important topic also that the great minds of the right need to commit themselves to dwelling upon for a little while. But just from a purely scientific standpoint, and it has nothing to do with natalism or anything like that. It's important to lock down the scientific facts about the reproductive capacities of adolescent girls for, the sake of knowledge and human progress.
Yeah. It's funny. I was just sitting here thinking, like, talking about the great minds of the right, and I was thinking, Patrick Deneen exists, Adrian Vermeule exists.
And Patrick Deneen is a very smart guy. Like, I have a review of his book coming out for the Bias magazine. I disagree with everything about it. Like, let's be clear, exception of a handful of things, but like way, way, way different league than Matt Walsh. Let's just be very clear about that.
My ideological frenemy Sorab exists, but like all of but out of the four of them, the one that anybody out there in the real world heard of, who's like, all for Catholics, socially conservative views, etc. The one that anybody's heard of is fucking Matt Walsh. That is almost enough to make me believe in original sin and fallenness, just all by itself.
So the existence of Matt Walsh is what's going to turn you to Matt Walsh's faith, just in a fucking existential crisis. That's kind of beautiful in a way.
Only a truly fallen world can produce Matt Walsh. Yeah.
Like, you didn't believe in the devil before, but then Matt Walsh came along. You're like, maybe some of this theism actually has a bit of explanatory power I didn't expect before. Give it another look.
Exactly. I've looked into the face of this. Yeah. Well, if that wasn't true about his thoughts about those other issues, I saw on this clip on TYT that the second I saw it, I thought, okay, my Canadian friend Matt is on tonight to talk about Matt Walsh. I think we're going to have to watch this.
The organizations, NFL and NHL, are both certainly a lot less manly today than they were even 10 years ago, certainly 30 years ago. But if we were having this conversation 10 years ago, before the NHL started doing Pride Nights and all the rest of it, then maybe you can make an argument for the NHL. But now, and the NFL went woke too, but not to that level. NHL has Pride Nights. NFL doesn't at this point, so NFL wins.
Oh, thank God. Matt Walsh is helping us figure out which sports are manly and which sports are not manly enough. And he has deduced that the National Hockey League is apparently not manly enough because they have Pride Nights.
Yeah, you should go say that on the ice and I'll get checked all fucking hell. It'll be fun to actually watch that. Like,
yeah.
What are you even fucking talking about? Like, well, from an aesthetic viewpoint, I've decided that hockey is just less manly than it was before. And this is the way that I'll register that. It's actually a quantifiable thing, manliness. You know, you have 0, which is not manly at all. And then you have fucking Stallone, Schwarzenegger up here, which is like a 9 on the manliness scale. And then what Donald Trump is 10, like Trump, like the peak of manliness in the world now or something?
Well, I will say this is not just, I mean, in that clip, he's really tying his argument against the manliness of hockey to this specific issue about Pride Nights. But elsewhere, he's made a much more general argument.
You can never be fully manly on ice skates. That's what figure skaters use. And it's a little bit sort of dainty, you know, you're ice skating around. The manlier thing is just to be on your own 2 feet.
Yeah. So I guess, you know, knights on horseback aren't manly on that basis because there's something a little bit weird about somebody who would want to ride around on a pony for a little while. So I guess all those neo-pagan Nietzscheans, you know, got to go back to school.
I mean, that's you know, come on. I mean, that's like how fruity is that?
Yeah, being in a tank, I mean, that's a little bit weird if you think about it. You should be out there on your own 2 feet, right? Flying in a plane, you know, doing the whole Ron DeSantis thing and deciding that you're going to stand as fucking Tom Cruise for a while. Super, super unmanly. Get on the fucking ground and you walk to the fucking wherever it is that you're going to go. That's what a real man does.
Yeah.
This is also just so bizarre. Like, does anybody ever actually spend time sitting and ruminating about that? Does this person have a job? Is there nothing more that this person wants to contribute to their life? Like, do they sit there and they think life is so preciously finite, and in all the kind of cosmic order, I am going to spend my time ruminating on the manliness of football versus the NHL, because that is just the central thing that my audience needs to think about right now.
Well, I mean, to be fair, you said, does he have a job? I mean, this is his job. This is if that's not what the Daily Wire is paying him for.
I suppose. Well, the Daily Wire has very low expectations of its pundits then, because if I were to show up anywhere else where I was supposed to offer public commentary and they were like, weigh in on the culture issues of the day, and I'm like, you know, let's talk about the manliness of hockey versus the manliness of fucking football, they'd be like, get out, close the door behind you, and never darken this space again. Let's bring in somebody on the right who has got like real things to say. You know, is Ben Shapiro over there? Dave Rubin? Bring in Dave, you know, the guy who likes to have deep conversations, that kind of shit.
I mean, look, I'm sure all of that. Also, if we're going to evaluate the claim on its own terms, you're going to take the sport where people getting into, like, you know, if there was a basketball game or a football game where 2 players just got into a fist fight in the middle of the corner of the field, you know, that would be like, I feel like that's something that they would be talking about on First Take for at least 2 weeks after it happened. Like, you know, it's not like, okay, well, you know, 2 minutes in the penalty box.
Well, you know what this reminds me of? And I'm sorry I got a little bit testy there. You know, my inner patriot was a little bit wounded by that expression. But the feeling I had reminded me of the way I used to feel when we watched this old Molson Canadian fucking commercial. And basically, it's this American guy. He's sitting there and he's like, oh, I hear you're from Canada, eh? You like some ice hockey, you want a donut? And then the guy checks him against the wall, jerseys him, and starts beating the shit out of him, just like you would at a hockey game. If Matt Walsh were to come and say that to me, I probably would have a very similar kind of reaction. And I'm not inherently a very violent person, but there's just something so deeply offensive to the entire nation of Canada about the way he conceives and speaks ill of our national religion, really.
Well, speaking of religions, tell me about his new book.
Well, it's more or less what you'd expect, right? So I went through 2 of his books. One is a book where he spends an awful lot of time chastiseing religious conservatives for not being quite judgmental enough. It reminds me again of that Simpsons episode. You remember with the one where Maude Flanders goes away, Bart, thinks that she's been murdered, and then she comes back. She's like, no. I went away for like Christian summer school to learn how to be more judgmental. Like that's basically what Matt Walsh's book is about. If they have a summer camp out there that is actually for Christians to become more judgmental, it's what will be assigned. But the main thing that he's known for is, again, this documentary, What is a Woman, and its accompanying book. I would not recommend perusing either of them, but if you are like me and you kind of have a perverse fascination in these things, I can tell you that you will not have a good time, and it is not particularly good. But a lot of the book is focused on this quest to essentially undermine various woke and medical narratives that are supportive of transgenderism, characterizing them as a threat, particularly to children, but also to the broader community. And at the end, asserting a kind of very superficial religious essentialism as the right gender essentialism as the right way for the United States going forward. And the arguments in it are about the level you'd expect. There's also a lot of vacillating back and forth between Matt Walsh trying to do the Michael Moore thing, coming across as just this nice, open-minded everyman who's there to listen, and characterizing his enemies as poison and gutless cowards and all the other kind of nasty stuff that you can see by just looking at his Twitter feed for an hour. Open it if you dare. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. So this is, this is interesting to me, because he's trying, like in the new book, Church of Cowards. Is that the name?
Yep. And like I said, this is one of the things I got into an argument about online when people were taking a couple pot shots at my article. Somebody said to me, like, listen, nowhere does he say that he hates trans people or that he is for hatred. And I'm like, well, that's not entirely true. And I'm like, listen, nobody ever sits there and says, I hate X, Y, or Z community, right? With the exception of very few members of the Ku Klux Klan and other white nationalists, most racists will sit there and be like, look, I'm a white identitarian, or I'm supportive of a white ethno state, or I believe in national difference, right? I just don't want to share a community with people who aren't like me, blah, 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 blah. What's actually distinctive about Matt Walsh is he's actually not afraid of the H word. So he's actually out there on the spectrum of people who is willing to embrace hate, because there's this long paean in Church of Cowards that's basically like, I understand a lot of ooey gooey Christians think that our faith tradition is about love and compassion and yada, yada, yada. Actually, there are a lot of good reasons to hate people. And somebody gave me shit for this online, being like, well, you're not reading it in context. Just read the next paragraph. I'm like, the one where he says we need to exterminate the things that we hate, or we need to exterminate what is worthy of hate in the world. I don't think that adding context in the book really actually makes this come across much better. If anything, this whole reference to annihilation and extermination makes what came before actually look a lot more scary.
What does it say about annihilation and extermination? That's actually, I will admit, I have read Church of Cowards. It's not even on my bedside. But I will admit that actually sounds further than I would expect from Walsh. What is he saying there?
He essentially argues, and he's non-specific in this text, I want to be clear, right? But the whole point is basically that we need hatred. Hatred is a kind of love. It's not the opposite of love, which is true, actually, insofar as it goes. But he talks about adopting this kind of militancy that's going to direct people to exterminate or annihilate what is worthy of hatred in the broader world. For the most part, immoral kinds of behavior, right? Now, again, this is couched in sometimes careful language about, love the sinner, hate the sin, yada, yada, yada. Don't engage in actual violence. We are warriors for Christ. But it's not that hard to kind of see how someone would pick up on this very loaded language of hatred, destruction, etc. I think maybe we shouldn't just be engaged in a spiritual war. Maybe a big W war is actually the better way to go about doing this.
Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, right? Like, if you, if you take all this seriously, it does, get a little bit hard to say, why not?
Yeah.
But yeah, so I will say I do want to give I do want to give Matt Walsh credit for one thing, at least. So our graphic designer Andy found this clip. There is a point. Apparently, he talks about this in the book where he does express an opinion that I think we could all get together on.
So, like, God's Not Dead would be a good example of that. I love what you said. You talked about. You said, "I'm not going to call the characters by name since the film creators or the scriptwriter didn't bother giving them a personality."
Yeah, and I think I went on pretty long about.
You did. It was fantastic because I mean we all agree it's a bad movie. It's if you meet a real life atheist, he's not going to yell, "I hate God because my mother died of cancer."
And that's what
the
other problem I had with that book, with that movie and the book. I guess I didn't read the book. Aside from everything I've already said, is that I think it really does the opposite of what it should do with a book with a story like that, where it's all about defending the faith against an atheist. That's what this story is. The service that movie should provide for the viewer as a Christian is to equip you to go out into the real world and actually have these debates and conversations. But I think it does the exact opposite, because if somebody gets their ideas of what an atheist is and what atheist arguments are like based on that movie, they're going to go out there and get slaughtered.
I actually fundamentally disagree. I would argue that the God's Not Dead franchise is the best thing that the evangelical community has produced in a very long time. I have enjoyed watching them and laughing at them on several different occasions. Add in a couple beers, and you got yourself a night. And so this is just another testament to the fact that his aesthetic taste is way off, completely out of whack.
I mean, sure, and I definitely enjoyed watching. I mean, I've only seen the first one, but I definitely enjoyed it. I think perhaps not at the level in which it was intended to be enjoyed, but whatever.
Oh, hey, are you kidding me? Like, fucking, you got Hercules sitting there, apparently teaches philosophy, doesn't really know that many philosophers, since apparently Stephen Hawking is now part of the canon, and just gets his ass owned by a first-year undergraduate who's breaks him down in front of his entire audience. What's not to love?
I actually had I think I probably deleted it, but I had a screenshot, or I might have been watching it on TV, and I just took a picture of, like, I paused, took a picture, because there's a moment early in the movie when the evil atheist philosophy professor has written down on the whiteboard this, like, long list of, he says, are the great thinkers, who are all atheists. And it's like, okay, depending on what kind of philosophy professor we're talking about, some of them I can understand, but it's like, it is the weirdest list. It's like
Richard Dawkins is on there, yeah.
Yeah, it's like Richard Dawkins,
Chomsky,
Michel Foucault, Noam Chomsky, and, like, Ayn Rand. I think she might really be on the whiteboard. And it's like, okay, we did a lot of research into what philosophy professors think before we wrote this, didn't we?
Well, the other thing that bothers me about this movie is it really demonstrates how contradictory a lot of their worldview is. Because I'm like, no, like, if you were an actual conservative intellectual, you should sit there and be like, that's never going to fucking happen because some Muslim student is going to be offended or whatever. And then the woke people are going to get to them because he's insisting that God's not dead. Like, that's supposed to be the running narrative that you're going for, right? This idea that, you'd have a philosophy professor who would just tell everybody, like, hey, abandon your religious belief or you're going to fail this class. Like, aren't they supposed to be deeply paranoid about that kind of thing? And
actually, yeah, I mean, there is an interesting question there about how this fits with their general idea of what universities are like. But honestly, it would have been much funnier if in the movie he was like, all right, everybody except for Fatima there has to write down God's not dead.
Yeah. Because, the DEI people, they're just not going to let me do that. So she gets off the hook, right? But yeah, I mean, the movie is just amazing, right? I mean, sometimes it gets so comical that, again, I just can't help but love the film. Like, there's one point where he's actually having, like, the philosophy professor, who has a real likeness to you, Ben. I think that maybe they drew some inspiration. But, like, he's actually sitting there just having, like, one of those really pompous, chummy conversations with his friends. And his fucking wife comes up to him and she's like, hey, he's like, I thought I told you that on campus it is professor. Never call me by my first name. I'm like, look, this guy is so fucking evil that he won't even let his wife call him by his first name in front of his colleagues. Like there's just nothing good about this guy. Just reprehensible to his very core. Also terrible at his job, since apparently he knows so little about the problems of God existence that he can get his ass handed to him by a first-year undergraduate who has never studied this problem comprehensively before and just flip through a few books on the weekend and then decide, well, there goes my 30-year career.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that he's not fired for doing that is just amazing.
Oh yeah, I mean, the only way he'd get away with it is if he fucking sat there and told all the undergrads, we are actually not going to learn anything for the first 4 classes. All you're going to do is sit there and listen to me debate this guy, and as long as you show up, you'll get fucking participation grades. There would probably be at least a couple of like keener students who'd be like, no, I came to this university to grade, but to learn. But every other person would be like, shut the fuck up, sit down, and just let them go at it. So we'll get our mark and get the fuck out of here.
Yeah, I mean, that's also, I mean, yeah, I love at the beginning of the movie when he says that we're not going to waste any time arguing about the existence of God, because, you know, this was already established by, you know, Michel Foucault, Richard Dawkins, and Ayn Rand, you know, that so instead everybody's has to write down this thing, and then the one guy who, you know, courageously refuses, like Marine Todd, is going to have to debate him. It's like, okay, so the thing at the very beginning of this, like, you know, if there's one thing you know about philosophy professors, is that they don't like actually talking about arguments.
Yeah, apparently. I mean, and also apparently they don't actually like teaching philosophy. They just want to argue with their students because that's the best way to assert their masculinity, right? But the whole movie is just so good. I mean, like, I'll watch it a million times because I enjoy it that much. Like, even the guys, like the fucking undergrad's girlfriend who takes this so seriously, is like, you cannot challenge him. If you challenge him, it's going to ruin your legal career. You're going to throw our lives away, and that's why I need to break up with you, just to raise the stakes a little bit. I'm like, but she actually fucking thinks that if
he failed, like, he failed his philosophy, like his philosophy class. That's like, what? Like, he can't even come back from that.
I'm like, yeah, you know what? Listen, if you fucking fail one first-year undergraduate class that's not even related to your fucking major, everyone else from here on in is just going to be one downward spiral. Can't allow that. Yeah, might as well just kill yourself now.
Exactly. Yeah, and again, I love that his evangelical girlfriend, like, is like, oh no, you shouldn't do that. It's like, come on, there's like she. I mean, the only reason she might say you shouldn't do that is she'd be like, no, you should report this guy to HR.
Like, he's completely out there, right? Like, yeah, like you should mobilize with the other students and take a complaint again to the DEI people, because there's something really fucking weird about the fact that he's like, all of you need to abandon your religious faith and buy into my BS. Do it.
Yeah.
Like, tenure is pretty strong, but it's not that strong.
No, it's definitely not that strong. That's a bit like, I honestly, I don't believe that you could, the idea that you could get away with doing that in a philosophy class at the University of Havana, never mind like some like state university that seems to be set out of the United States, where, you know, the vast majority of students are going to have some kind of religious belief, is astounding. But
and I do love how fucking arrogant that guy becomes also. Like, I remember there's that one sequence with his wife, again, who's serving all the faculty, and they are just mocking her religious beliefs in front of him, and he sits there and eggs them on. He's like, yeah, basically saying like, yeah, honey, you are dumb. It's time to give up on all that. And to be fair, she does divorce his ass at the end. I guess it's not a very evangelical Christian thing to do. But I'm like, is anybody actually this fucking stupid? Like, did he never sit there and get told by some parent, like, listen, probably not a good idea in a marriage to mock your own wife's religious beliefs in front of a crowd of your colleagues and then egg them on to sneer at her more effectively? That is not going to be conducive to like your long-term fucking happiness.
One might think. But, yeah.
God, I love that movie so much.
So So Matt Walsh will at least acknowledge that God's not dead is not a useful guide to how Christians should act in the world and spread their faith and all of that. But
there are good Christian movies out there. Like we were talking Martin Scorsese before we came on the program, like Silence, brilliant film, right? You really want to watch a film that's like a hardcore Catholic, test your faith, kind of brutal slog that'll make you feel guilty and horrendous all at once, like any good Catholic should feel. Like watch Silence, and at the end of it, if you don't need a stiff drink, write to me because you're a tougher person than I am.
Yeah. Have you ever watched or read the play Heroes of the Fourth Turning?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. So it's this Will Arbery, who actually writes for Succession, wrote this. He's actually going to be on the show next month to talk about this. I was just reading it.
Oh, that's cool.
It's and it's set at this more or less at this sort of it's like alumni who are all like super duper hardcore conservatives are coming back to this event at the Catholic college they all went to, and they're having this big argument over the course of the night about religion and politics and other things. At this point where their like beloved professor, who is now going to be the president of the college, is like, sort of shows up and is like arguing with him about all this stuff. And like the last thing she says before she leaves is, kids, don't be dark and complicated. I know it's very Catholic, but even
yeah, it's good advice. Yeah. I mean, that shit never leaves either. I remember watching a movie. I think it was called like The Brothers Duff or something. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But like at one point, the guy sits there and he's like, you got to go to church on Sunday, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, you don't even believe in God anymore, Dad. And he's like, doesn't mean I'm not a good Catholic. And I was like, yes, that's true. That shit does not leave you. Once you get imprinted with like that James Joyce monologue about hell, like in Portrait of the Artist Young Man, that shit sticks.
Fair enough. Okay, so let's talk about the kind of Catholic that Matt Walsh is, and how he thinks that Christians should approach the world, since this is this is not something that I'm unfamiliar with, this set of issues, but it's not one that I can approach from inside the way that you can, since not a Christian, never have been, and you have interesting things to say in the article about how Walsh thinks about this stuff versus how a Christian like Kierkegaard, would think of how Christians should relate to the world.
Well, this is the kind of important thing, right? Which is actually a broadly disappointing thing about a lot of these pop conservative commentators, is that I don't even think they read the books in their own tradition all that carefully, right? So there are references to a few different Catholic and broadly Christian authors in Walsh's book, Church of Cowards, many of which are just wrong in their interpretation of what these figures are arguing for. And I don't mean a little wrong. I just mean flat out incorrect, right? So the two most egregious examples of this that I can think of is he talks about Soren Kierkegaard at various points, referencing the fact that Kierkegaard apparently said that to live a life without God is one that's going to be lived in despair. Now, that is to a certain extent true in The Sickness Unto Death. But first off, there are technical problems with reading that book as just an explanation of Christian despair, since it wasn't written by Kierkegaard, but by Anticlimacus. And there's a lot of debate going on in the philosophical community about how literally one should interpret these books as representative of Kierkegaard's views more broadly. But the more important point that I stress in the book is nowhere does Kierkegaard say that one cannot have a fulfilling life without belief. In fact, one of the most central facets of his work that's really interesting is this idea of there being spheres of existence, or spheres of life, as it's sometimes translated, where the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious, or the faithful. And Kierkegaard says a lot of philosophers, going all the way back to Plato, but exemplified by Hegel, think that you can have it all, basically, right? You can live an aesthetically interesting life that will also be dedicated to God and conform to social ethics. And Kierkegaard says, I don't think that that's true, right? If you're going to lead an aesthetically interesting life, like Lord Byron, or Hamlet, then you're probably going to end up violating at least a couple of your society's ethical norms. William Burroughs is a very aesthetically interesting person. I don't exactly know that he's a very good person, but would I want to go have a beer with him over your Joe Schmo social conservative? Probably, yeah. By contrast, an ethical person has a kind of stolidness, security, orderliness to their life, and there's kind of completeness to their existence that you can't find in the very exciting and very perfectionist aesthetic sphere. And then we get to the sphere of faith, and this is again what's really problematic for people like Walsh, where Walsh tends to think that faith is just a matter of common sense, is a term that he uses throughout a lot of his work, right? And that being a faithful person will bring us down to common sense, ethical morality. And what Kierkegaard always insists, most famously in his best-known book, is that actually faith makes a lot of demands of people that are completely contrary to common sense. The famous example in Fear and Trembling is of the story of Abraham and Isaac, right? Where God says to Abraham, "I want you to go and sacrifice your only son Isaac to me." And Abraham goes out and does that dutifully. And Kierkegaard says, there's really no way of describing this as an ethical act, right? God said, murder your son. Abraham dutifully goes out and does this. So he says there's a teleological suspension of what we might call social conservative or ethical morality that is required for you to be a faithful individual. Completely contrary to Walsh's own interpretation of what Christianity or faith is supposed to be about, despite the fact that he seems to apparently have read the Wikipedia page, probably not even that, of Kierkegaard, right? The other figure that really bothered me is to be pissed off at him, as he cites a well-known Catholic philosopher called Charles Taylor, still alive, probably will live forever, just like Keith Richards will, which I'm happy about, and also Kissinger, which I'm less happy about, but that's neither here nor there. Charles Taylor wrote a very interesting book called The Secular Age, which I'd recommend everybody read if you have a million years, because it's a fucking brick. And the kind of argument laid out in this book is that secularization theory has been widely misunderstood, mostly by right-wing Christians. Secularization has been understood as something that occurred to the Christian tradition, which came under assault by modernity, scientific rationalism, all kinds of hippie smoking weed, you name it, right? What Taylor does is actually say, no, that seems a really strange. This is putting it really simply, by the way. The book is 1,000 pages, right? Because if Christianity really was this extraordinarily powerful, convincing, even hegemonic faith tradition, then nothing external would have really been able to breach it. Actually, what ended up occurring was secularization emerged from imminent trends within Christianity itself. Also Nietzsche's thesis, by the way, and Weber's. Particularly, this is again putting it really simply, Protestantism, right? Where Protestantism moved people inwards rather than focusing on the kind of sacred external world, contemplating their own inner self, if you want to put it this way. And this eventually leads, he thinks, to certain things like liberalism, this ethic that, I should express myself and my actions. And the most important thing is my purity of heart, my thoughts, my way of looking at the world. Again, putting it really simply. And over time, this becomes secularized because it's detached from the sacred sense of the world, but it still has roots in the Christian tradition. So it's a very interesting argument and contribution to secularization theory. But Walsh just completely misses that, right? Saying that, Taylor is just some guy who says that secularization happened. It's a bad thing. We've become these buffered cells, disconnected from God, without ever acknowledging that what makes Taylor's book really shocking is, like Nietzsche, he says, secularism didn't happen to Christianity. Secularism happened through Christianity. And the secular world we live in is very much the product of Christendom in that respects. And Taylor's a nice guy. He's an NDP supporter, social democrat, argues for a lot of good left-wing causes. So that also offended me. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah. I think the point about common sense is really interesting because it's also, there's something like really strange about the idea that on the one hand, you're like in the world but not of it. You believe in this, you believe in this transcendent message of radical counterintuitive love, and loving your enemies, and all this stuff. And also, though, your views about hot button issues should just be guided by like whatever's considered to be common sense in your society.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we got to be careful because Kierkegaard sometimes talks about a transcendent realm, but this is again what differentiates him from, say, Catholics, where he says the thing is that this is purely has to be undertaken as a leap of faith that postulates the existence of this transcendent realm. It can't be proved through reason, let alone intellectual activity, because that brings you back to the aesthetic sphere, and it also can't just be asserted as necessary for the sake of your moral viewpoint, which is also part of the problem that that Walsh makes, right? Where he says, well, believing in God is a good moral thing to do. Kierkegaard would say, if you're doing that, then you are reducing the existence of God to something that is personally important to you and also politically important for the maintenance of your society. And that is taking it with very little seriousness, because you're essentially turning God into what Marx described, the opiate of the masses, right? Necessary to conserve your society. Actually, by the end of his life, he was so committed to this that Kierkegaard said, I actually want there to be less Christians in the world, because the worst thing to ever happen to Christianity is Christendom. I don't kid you, right? Because Christendom is a world filled with people who think that Christianity is about social conservatism and a glue holding society together. And it's not, right? Christianity is something that makes radically demands of individuals that are almost intrinsically asocial or even antisocial, if you think about Abraham. And it calls them to something that transcends the ethical, or that teleologically suspends the ethical. And, if Kierkegaard were here, he'd say that the problem with Matt Walsh's Christianity isn't that it's not hateful enough. It's that it's a very cheap kind of Christianity. It's Christianity bought for a discount.
Right. Well, I do want to maybe transition a little bit to what you say in the article about the underlying issue, right? I mean, we've kind of been talking about the way that Walsh frames things, and and his the way he thinks about Christianity, and the way he thinks about the relationship between Christianity and social conservatism, and how that misrepresents what a lot of thinkers who he's like plucked gems from WikiQuote have to say, that like what those thinkers actually believe. But I do want to get
WikiQuotes is really helpful that way. You know what I mean? You're just like, yeah, like let's get the meat and potatoes of it. That's fine.
Well, I think
easier than reading those people.
His boss at the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro, a book that unfortunately we've both read, The Right Side of History: How Reason and Moral Purpose made the West Great. If it wasn't WikiQuote, it was some research assistant who was doing the equivalent. Because there's so many that book is just peppered with, as St. Augustine, Immanuel Kant, whatever, and then like every time he says the full name, that he has their birth and death dates after it,
yeah,
stack of index cards, where those were written down, a lot of times in context it's pretty clear he didn't do the reading, but yeah, so moving aside from all that to the actual core of the issue, one of the things that I really like about this article is when you're criticizing what Walsh has to say about trans people, trans rights, and that like his sort of obsession with kind of this common sense based, like, hey, come on, man, you people don't even know what a woman is, sort of obsession.
Also, his obsession with what people are doing with their genitals. Let's be clear about that. He spends an awful lot of time thinking about that.
His obsession with the like what he wants the argument to be about is the metaphysics of gender. Who is deeply objectively what, and in your article about him, I think that you do this very smart thing, which is like, look, whatever, right? I mean, that might be a philosophically interesting conversation that we can like sit around and debate, but you don't really need that. Like, you don't need to sort of settle the metaphysical mysteries here in order to address the core normative issues. So I mean, there are obviously edge cases and gray areas, and arguments that that people who aren't insane bigots who, think that hockey is gay, can have about, about like certain kinds of issues about women's spaces or about, what exactly the political threshold should be, for puberty blockers or whatever, all interesting issues. But on the sort of broad, like, you don't get into all of that, in the article, but just on the sort of the core normative issues, because Matt Walsh is somebody who, like, it's not like he just has some like slightly different view about the edge cases than the liberals or leftists he's criticizing. He's somebody who very explicitly says nobody should be allowed to do this. That like nobody should be allowed to change the body in this way. And if you want to let them do that, then you're just going along with mutilating people. And if you like call somebody what they want to be called, then you're just participating in a delusion. And those strike me as very easy normative issues. And I think the point you make really forcefully in the article is like, look, yeah, man, come on, we could have our like, graduate seminar discussion about like, what the necessary and sufficient conditions are for counting as a man or a woman later. But like, there are just these like straightforward moral reasons to think that these are pretty despicable positions.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And again, the argumentative methodology of the book is all over the place, probably by necessity, right? Where at various points, again, he'll try to present himself as essentially a scientific rationalist who's just asking difficult questions that can be answered by an appeal to empirical facts. And everybody who's opposed to him is just denying what seems to be prima facie obvious. Except, of course, that many members of the medical establishment, the scientific community, actually endorse things like trans healthcare. Then he'll just sit there and say they're only in it for the money, they're ideologues, except for this one person who does agree with me. She's board certified and absolutely A-okay, right? Other points, I think we get a little bit more of an honest kind of argumentative methodology where he'll just outright come and argue theically for the need to kind of conform to the gender or sex that was assigned to us by God, essentially, right? Rather than trying to engage in what he calls this Promethean project. Really, Luciferian would probably be more apt from his standpoint of trying to overcome the limitations or the expectations that God has imposed upon us. And there are, frankly, right-wing thinkers out there who have argued for all of his positions way better, which is why I said he probably shouldn't be the one doing this, because it's not his forte, right? Peter Lawler, for example, in his book American Heresies, has this long Catholic digression on transition people that I think the left would be better off critiquing if we were trying to get into the metaphysics of gender. So instead, what I decided to focus on was just what you said, the kind of moral issue. And here I think there are really two issues that come up, right? One is, do we think that adults should be able to transition if that is what they wish? And there I think the answer is categorically yes, right? People have a moral entitlement to do what it is that they want with their bodies within, fairly broad parameters within our society, so long as they aren't harming anyone else in, a meaningful way. And things become trickier, obviously, when it comes to children. But I think, we're having a debate and a discussion about that. That's well worth having, right? And then the second question is, do we think it's important to actually have that choice respected by others? From, let's use Walsh's term, or Kierkegaard's term, an ethical standpoint. And there I actually, as you know, cited you, where I'm like, look, this doesn't seem very meaningfully different for me as a norm than asking someone who has an adopted daughter to just say, that is my daughter. You can sit there and try to do the Matt Walsh thing and say, well, no, because that is not, from a biologically reductive, foundationalist standpoint, technically true. I refuse to do that. Or you could just sit there and fucking say it, and the world would go on better, and you'll demonstrate respect and care for another human being who, as your fellow citizen, is probably entitled to something like that. So on these two issues, I think the normative approach is very, very clear. We can have a discussion about the metaphysics of gender, and I want to assert that trans women are women, as far as I'm concerned. But Matt Walsh is just not worth the time to go about doing so.
Yeah. Well, it's a really good article. People should read it. It's Jacobin. Matt, what else? What else do you have cooking? Where can people find your stuff?
I got a few things going on right now. So I have an article coming out soon for the Bias Magazine, Institute for Christian Socialism. That's a review of Pat Deneen's book, Regime Change. Pat Deneen is a much more interesting conservative thinker, let's put it this way. So my critique is a lot more thorough. And then forthcoming, I've got a few different things. So my book, The Political Right and Equality, is coming out in July. If people are interested in my broader thoughts on way better conservative thinkers than Matt Walsh, they should check that out. And in fall, finally, after many, many years, How to Guide to Cosmopolitan Socialism will be coming out for 0 books. And I really hope that people check this out.
Nice. So yeah, I was really interested to read this essay, and I was thinking about ways that we could get into. All right. Cool. Well, people should read all those things. So I'm going to watch in the second of the episode things going a little bit choppily because I'm having to direct the StreamYard here since our producer Jake is taking a very well-deserved night off for his birthday. Everybody tell Jake happy birthday. But I'm going to watch, so earlier this week, earlier this week, this is Monday, early last week, I had this discussion with Christine Sypnowich on an essay that she wrote for the Boston Review. They did a forum. She wrote this main essay, and a bunch of people wrote responses to her called "What's Wrong with Equality of Opportunity," where she argues that egalitarians shouldn't care about equality of opportunity; they should worry about equality of flourishing. And so the Boston Review, the Philosopher magazine, co-hosted the Zoom event where I was in conversation with her for about 45 minutes. So we're going to watch that right now. When that is done, we are going to go to the postgame for patrons, where we have Zac and Gavin from the Vanguard. So that should be fun. Been on their show a few times. This is the first time they've been on this one. But yeah. Meanwhile, we're going to watch my conversation with Christine Sypnowich. Thank you so much, Matt, and I will see you very soon.
Yeah, take care, Russ. Left is best.
Talking about it, and I know that there are people who are watching from various places, as we just established, who have different levels of background, kind of familiarity with some of this literature and some of the debates that you're intervening in here. So I thought one kind of straightforward way of getting into it would be to start by talking a little bit about the view that you are disagreeing with, that the sort of obviously there's this sort of larger cultural idea that equality of opportunity is a particularly important kind of equality, but there's also a philosophical articulation that includes, figures like Jacobin, who we're both interested in, that is called luck egalitarianism. That's part of what you're criticizing in this essay. So do you want to just kind of start us off a little bit about what the luck egalitarians say before we get into why you think they're wrong?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Ben. Thanks very much for doing this. And thank you to the Philosopher and Anthony and Boston Review and Matt Lord for putting this together. It's wonderful to talk about these really important questions. Well, I guess it's fair enough to say that liberal democratic capitalist societies are all united by a commitment to the idea that individuals should be treated with equal respect. Sure, there's racism and discrimination around, but in general, it's not really respectable to articulate those in most forums. So we have this conviction that people should be treated with equal respect. And then the question is, how does that play out in various domains? And in particular, the domain of opportunities and positions and people's socioeconomic situation. And there, liberal democratic capitalist societies tend to be described as being founded on the principle of equality of opportunity. And by that, we mean that, well, at a minimum, people should be able to pursue their goals without encountering discrimination or bigotry or prejudice. So opportunities and positions should be open to people without those kinds of barriers. But obviously, that's a fairly modest demand to make of equality of opportunity, that you're not ruled out just because of your skin color, for example. So liberal egalitarians have wanted to go further and elaborate the equality of opportunity idea a little bit more, to think about ways in which people can, in a sense, be not really at the same starting line due to differences in educational status, family background, and other kinds of social ingredients that mean that some people are worse off compared to others through no fault of their own. So that more elaborate and more substantive idea of equality of opportunity is what thinkers like John Rawls and Ronald Dworkin, for example, who are, probably the two of the most well-known liberal egalitarians, have articulated. But that liberal egalitarian view could nonetheless be thought of as potentially a kind of no strings attached idea. And so some people have wanted to say, well, if we really take equality of opportunity seriously and thinking that what we want to remove are those arbitrary obstacles, what about obstacles that aren't so arbitrary? So in that case, maybe we want to say that some people have disadvantages that are the result of circumstances beyond their control, but other people have disadvantages that are the result of choice or decisions that they've made. And that justice requires that we remedy the first kind of disadvantage, but not the second. So people have taken the view that equality of opportunity really dictates this luck egalitarian view, where we want to say that people's disadvantages, which are the result of bad brute luck, are unjust, but people whose disadvantages are the result of choices or decisions that they made, gambles or imprudent elections in terms of how to run their lives, those are things that we don't think are appropriately justly remedied.
Yeah,
that's in a sense the foundational canonical view in mainstream liberal egalitarianism.
right. And I should say that something you mentioned briefly in your essay, but is that there's the sort of left liberal version of something like luck egalitarianism, where you're only what you're worried about remedying are social disadvantages, those kinds of factors that you just mentioned, educational status, family background, but there's also a sort of deeper kind of luck egalitarianism, where you say, well, the unchosen disadvantages that are also inside your own head are also relevant. That if I had done, inside your own skin at least, right? If I had done nothing all day every day, but practice basketball, I would probably not have a future in the NBA. If I'd done this from a very early age and I had great coaches, not everybody started as the same physical starting points. Not everybody, if people, and also maybe more relevantly, the sort of cognitive advantages that lead people to test well, or have and be better at retaining certain kinds of information, or have are in 1,000 ways advantageous for climbing the career ladder of the professional managerial class to get out of poverty in advanced capitalist democracies, are the kinds of things that are themselves, as some luck egalitarians have recognized, not up to you. It's maybe up to you how much you develop these advantages, but it's not up to you what your starting point is, or how you have them, right? So I mean that is, I guess I just wanted to push that a little bit before we get to your criticisms, because I think that there is one way of sort of that's maybe contained in this of sort of saying there are kind of more radical resources within this view for criticizing more kinds of equality than people might think, because when we hear the phrase quality of opportunity, we have a certain set of cultural and political associations with that. But if there is a way of thinking about equality of opportunity that would say, no, even we should find even inequalities that come from your own your own internal capacities problematic, because obviously some philosophers would say nothing is up to you, but but even if some things are up to you, those aren't.
Yeah, well, sure. The scope of what we decide is a matter of luck or circumstance, or the kinds of contingencies over which one doesn't have control might be very large. So a left-wing luck egalitarian might say, look, I invoke luck to point out how much of inequality and disadvantage is the result of bad brute luck and how little is the result of choice. So that is true. But I guess I wonder, why play into that right-wing discourse at all? Why think of there as sort of being a cue and you take some people as a cue for the remedy of disadvantage if they don't meet that bar of being not being responsible for their disadvantage. And I guess I think that choice and decision making is just so mired in circumstance. How prudent people are, for example, how confident they are, how resourceful they are. So even our choice-making capacities could be argued as in the domain of circumstance. And so I would think that if we want to attend to the really grave inequalities in our world, we have to look at outcomes. How are people doing? What lot do they have in life? What are they flourishing? Do they have well-being? And I think that's really just going back to that famous mantra from Karl Marx that, from each according to their ability and to each according to their need. And so we want to make sure that people's needs are met. And I think this invoking of responsibility and choice, prudent decision-making and so forth, is just unhelpful, even if it may be that the left-wing luck egalitarians and I end up agreeing on what policies to adopt and so forth. I think that we should avoid this kind of responsibility talk. And it's interesting. I mean, I was really taken aback that Jerry Cohen, who left-wing on all kinds of fronts, applauded Ronald Dworkin for in coming up with this circumstance versus choice distinction, and said, hooray, you've helped yourself to this right-wing idea of choice and responsibility and brought it into the egalitarian fold. This is a great service. And I thought, no, it is not a great service. This is unfortunate. Now, of course, if you might think that this is politically valuable, but I think in some ways the academy is a little bit too squeamish and timid on these issues. I mean, even in the real world of liberal egalitarian politics, which God knows is not egalitarian enough, there's much more preparedness to hand out, if you like, the remedy to one's disadvantage with no questions asked. So think of socialized medicine, for example. It is not the case that when you end up in the emergency department, you're asked, why is it that you have a broken arm? Were you in a car accident, or did you get drunk and jump off a roof? No one asked that question. Rather, your healthcare is just provided. It's not even triaged. It's just the way we think that needs should be met. Now, like egalitarians might say, oh, well, wait a minute, there's certain things that, those are too important to be at the mercy of this choice circumstance distinction. But then I guess I just start to wonder why if you start to pile on these qualifications, maybe the theory is actually not doing much work for you, and it's best abandoned.
I wonder, because I would imagine that in your example about universal health care, my guess would be that not only the vast majority of people who support it, which is, I guess, where you are, if, even conservatives have to at least sort of pretend to, but even the vast majority of at least vaguely left-wing people who support it probably do take it for granted that there is a distinction between the kinds of goods that should just be a baseline for everybody. That healthcare would certainly be in, or like, I don't know, K-12 public education would certainly be in. Some of us think higher education should be in, et cetera. That everybody, that everybody should just get, as that it's like unreasonable or unjust to deny anybody these things for any reason. But they don't really start from the view that everything goes in that basket, or at least, everything can't be in that basket, limited resources, whatever, but at least an equal quantity of everything is in that basket. And so I wonder if one way to take Cohen's point about Dworkin is to say that these are incredibly widely and deeply held intuitions that responsibility and choice matter in some way, that it's not that at the very least there's something that's like especially outrageous about inequalities over which you have no control, and that it's that it could be seen as a service, both just in service of the truth, if we think that there's something to this intuition, and certainly politically a service if you're trying to show how ideals widely held by your adversaries would actually lead to your conclusion, that to say, no, this is something that actually, if you take this really seriously, you need incredibly deep redistribution, or it's probably just not compatible with with capitalist property relations, which is, honestly, I've always thought, so Cohen makes this distinction between bourgeois equality of opportunity, which is just like you can't have laws saying that if that like people of a certain skin color can't have certain opportunities or whatever. Left liberal equality of opportunity, which is no social disadvantages, and what he calls socialist equality of opportunity, which is also no disadvantages, unchosen disadvantages within your head, messing with the distribution. But I've always wondered if even the left liberal equality of opportunity, that's taken really seriously. Like could you reconcile that with capitalist property relations? That even if there are various things that left liberals who accept capitalism would support doing to try to rectify that to a certain extent, but ultimately, if you have things like inheritance rights, it's really hard not to see how you're going to get large distributive inequalities that are tethered to factors outside of your control, even in that sense, right? Even in that social sense. So I guess I'm wondering, from you, like, if you think, I guess what you would think about both halves of that, right? So one is whether there is something useful about appealing to intuitions that are widely held, even by, I think we could even take conservatives out of it, even by like sort of nice social democrats who think that, like, of course, we should have universal health care, that there is something that's, that like some goods everybody has a right to, others, others we need these other principles to sort of figure out. And then the other half would be, even if you think, clearly you do, right? And this is what you make your case for in your excellent essay, but like, even if you think that other kinds of inequality matter, is there anything to that idea that there's something sort of particularly outrageous about inequalities that people have no control over because they're tied to factors over outside of their control?
Yeah, I guess though, I think that when it comes right down to it, it looks like that basically is the problem of inequality in general. I don't think it's very helpful to say, but there's this little tiny package of disadvantage that's the result of, foolish decision making, and it's down on you. I mean, if you want to play that game in the real world, and of course, people like Cohen say sometimes you have to do kind of crappy things in the real world to make some political gains, even though it's a compromise to the principles that you think are important. Maybe that's true, but actually I'm not so sure. I mean, I think if someone said to you, should you have an equal opportunity to this, something that's really important to your well-being, or should you have the thing that's really important to your well-being, I think we probably actually think this equal opportunity idea is fairly abstract and obscure, actually, for a lot of ordinary people. But people say it as a mantra because they're told that, equality of outcome, there lies the Soviet communism. But I don't, if you actually put the question to them, I think they find it a little strange that you're going to have this sort of filter or this test that has to be met. And I guess another thing is that the egalitarian ideal involves relations of solidarity and community, which I think really pulls against this way of understanding equality of opportunity and like egalitarianism, even on these more generous progressive versions. And indeed, Cohen, in the essay that's behind you there, actually confesses that he's a little uneasy about the tension he sees between the principle of community and the sort of what he thinks of as justice-based ideas that, if it's your fault, it's on you. And he has this wonderful example of a socialist camping trip, right, where all the campers come and share their resources. Well, thinking about the real world and camping trips, it often is one of the campers comes and they're clueless. They haven't brought any equipment. They don't know how, they sleep in instead of getting up to get on with the tasks of the day and so forth. People have conversations with that person saying, hey, come on, pitch in. But they don't say, okay, you're not in the tent because you forgot to bring one, or we just think that there's this kind of collective enterprise that we're all committed to, and that only goes well for all of us if we see the well-being of every member as important. And I think that ideal is too easily lost. And again, it's thought of, isn't that just a kind of icing on the cake, not really what's important. But I think that material deprivation has among its wrongs the impact on our social relations. And so we really need to think more broadly about the term I use as human flourishing, is what we are trying to make people equal in. And when we think along those lines, we might think that living a life that's characterized by imprudent decision-making means you're less likely to flourish. It's much better to be self-determining, responsible, and so forth. But that's not the basis for a kind of punitive approach where you're denied resources because you're imprudent. It's rather to think of a life well lived as a life where one takes responsibility and so forth. But mainly what makes a life characterized by flourishing or well-being is to have those good outcomes, to have your life going well, and rather than the opportunity for it to go well. And so I think that preoccupation that liberal egalitarians also have, which is to the means to whatever ends one might want to pursue, is also handicapping the egalitarian discourse in ways that are unhelpful. And sort of mean-spirited and kind of grudging, which is just sort of contrary to the whole egalitarian ideal.
Got it. Well, obviously we could keep talking about this part for a very long time, and I would enjoy that. But I do want to make sure that the time that we have, that we kind of cover the other half of the topic. So you kind of took us there at the end of your last comments, but since the larger topic is essentially, well, it's the one that a lot of the classic, I think there are like at least 2 or 3 of the classic essays about this are called like Equality of What, right? And so we've been talking about your criticisms of one very popular answer to that, which is equality of opportunity. And I want to get into your own positive view. So you've already used the word flourishing, which is what you think that we should be aiming at equalizing, that everybody's living equally flourishing lives. So I mean, this is obviously, as our host said at the beginning, a certain species of equality of outcome. But I mean, what's the I do want to drill into this a little bit philosophically. So I mean, like what does flourishing mean to you? I mean, that this is like a like that's clearly some sort of positive outcome. But I mean, what sort are we talking about, and how do we decide?
Thanks, Ben. Well, I mean, I have my own particular sense of what that is, but I think it's the kind of thing that probably we would want to negotiate and elaborate, and which would evolve and change. But it does have what's often called a perfectionist dimension, which is some idea of objectively valuable pursuits. And I think tied with that is realizing your potential, making the most of your capacities, and doing things and pursuing things and enjoying things and engaging in things that are actually worth doing. So that's one dimension. And another is a self-determining autonomy type dimension. And then I think one has to give a nod to hedonistic type considerations of finding contentment. Now, I don't have it worked out in terms of the weight given to these various things, but that's what I think is the way we ought to think of flourishing. And so it would involve a lot of different kinds of considerations, socioeconomic considerations of the kind that egalitarians usually talk about in terms of income and wealth, but also more specifically housing, nourishment, healthcare, the things that keep the bodily self going and going well. Things like education as well, and leisure activities, access to nature, and so forth. And also, I think issues of alienation, loneliness, isolation, those are things that are hugely important in terms of whether one thinks one's life is going well. So I think a political community has to attend to those other ways in which we don't flourish. And actually, even though liberal egalitarians are for the most part, pretty hostile to this flourishing view and insist on a neutrality perspective where the state is neutral about the good and gives people the means to pursue whatever ends they choose. In fact, we are quite accustomed to societies that aren't egalitarian enough, but nonetheless, they do certain things on the assumption that we can all agree this is good for you. So libraries lend books for free, for example. The arts are funded. We have parks, and if a developer wants to build something, they're usually told you got to have some green space with that. Why? Because we think green space is good for people. So we actually are much more prepared in the real world to think about these issues and are much less squeamish, I think, than the liberal egalitarian philosophies that we're inundated with. And sometimes I think we need to sort of step back from the ivory tower and think, hey, wait, are we not being kind of pushed along and kind of abstract theorizing that really doesn't connect with why these issues are important?
Yeah, so you raised the issue about neutrality here, that one view that like one reason I think that for some egalitarian philosophers to hold back from thinking that the thing that we should be the thing that we should be equalizing is everybody living a flourishing life is I mean, just to kind of spell out some of what you were getting, the concern that you were just addressing there, like that, I think like a really intuitive way of seeing why some people would hold back from that is saying, well, okay, this is what counts as a really good flourishing life. Says who, right? Like that, that gets to decide what counts as that. Different people have very different ideas about what counts as a good, as a good life. I mean, if you think about the sort of differences between what sort of religious ascetics, who might, live in a monastery, think of as a good life, and and other, more common ideas about that. There's a great diversity there, and people say that the state should be neutral in that. Then I think that there's this subsense in which we don't really, we don't really want a state, that's in the business of deciding what counts as a good life. We want people to be free to pursue their own vision of a good life. Now, I take your point that that's actually, that if you say it at that level of abstraction, everybody nods, or not everybody. There are all sorts of people who wouldn't, but like everybody within a certain range of political views maybe nods when you put it that way. But I do see your point that there are a lot of ways in which, in practice, this would be a much more extreme view than we think. Because, okay, do you not think that the state should be in the business of promoting reading and green space and and all of those things? And I think that's a really fair point. But I did just want to push you on this a little bit. Is there I assume you don't think that there's sort of nothing to neutrality worries, right? That we don't, that there's nothing undesirable about a state sort of taking sides and really fine-grained arguments about what counts as a good life. Is there a kind of neutrality worth wanting, or not? Or if there is one, is it just that you think that there's no way that the kind of neutrality that's worth wanting is not so broad that it becomes a concern for this view that the state should be in the business of promoting equal flourishing?
Well, I think it has to be pluralistic. It's not that there's one answer to this question. There's a very wide range of valuable pursuits, and what's valuable for one person, particularly given their talents and aptitudes and interests, will be different from what's flourishing for another. So I think there's a lot of scope for diversity in this view. Certainly the idea of impartiality in the law is super important, and I think that's where we've gone wrong. What I call the juridicalization of politics, in that we've transplanted a very important and valuable idea of equality before the law, the rule of law, that the law should treat us impartially, that the law applies to us all equally. That idea, and we're now thinking that it's the way to characterize politics more broadly. And I think it's worth noting that this is a fairly recent view. It's a kind of post-war view, coincides with the Cold War. But egalitarians earlier in this century and the previous century just took it as common sense, that what egalitarianism was all about was trying to enable people to live equally good lives, as much as that is possible. Clearly, things like one's propensity to cheerfulness will have some impact on how happy or well you're living, but nonetheless, there's a lot more that we could do.
Counseling sessions to make you more cheerful.
Well, I think we do live in societies that are characterized by deep loneliness, that and poor mental health. I think that's an inequality too. Indeed, arguably, once you reach a certain kind of threshold of material well-being, those other things start to become much more important. And I think we need to think of it as part of the egalitarian project, not something separate from it.
Right. Yeah. So, I wonder. I'm wondering about this neutrality worry, and I really like that last point about mental health. But I wonder how that worry would, if this is actually a sort of particular problem for your view, or whether there are plausible things that could say about it sort of mirror what kind of any egalitarian has to say. In other words, that that anybody who thinks once you've decided what your answer is to the equality of what question, assuming that it's not such a minimalistic answer that like we already have it and just don't worry about it. Like, you know, that you have that it's that you've identified some really, you know, persistent source of inequality. There's going to have to be some sort of balancing of values. You know, that the you know, like nobody who you know, if I give my sister a birthday present, you know, I've perhaps, you know, slightly increased the amount of inequality in the world because, you know, all the people who, you know, through no fault of their own, you know, they didn't choose not to be my sister, you know, they didn't get that present, but that's also fine, right? It's not objectionable for me to do that. And certainly, you have, you know, certainly you have other values that, you know, like even when we start thinking about economic institutions, there's certainly values like efficiency that, you know, that could pull in the other direction. You know, you quoted Marx earlier, from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. But of course, that, you know, you only get that in the upper phase of a communist society. Once you have material abundance, you know, before then, you know, he's willing to tie distribution to labor contributions, not because people particularly deserve it, but just as a way, just as an incentive, you know, for greater economic output. And so I wonder how much of this neutrality concern could just be say, okay, look, you know, we obviously value personal freedom, and when you start thinking about the state getting to decide what counts as a good life, I wonder how much of the pushback is just people who are sort of thinking about ways in which that could become intrusive, you know, because it's you know, the state is meddling too much in your lives, but how much you can just respond to that by saying, yeah, but I'm just talking about what's sort of desirable in terms of distributed, you know, justice. Obviously, that has to be balanced against other considerations like some reasonable degree of non-interference.
Yeah, certainly, of course. Yeah, it's not constant meddling. I mean, that's the sort of caricature that might be thrown my way, but I think that would be unreasonable. And as I say, we do actually take the view that there are things that the political community thinks are worthwhile, and we don't leave it to the market to decide whether or not they're available. We make sure they're available, and we have ways of incentivizing people's likelihood of taking them up. And so I think that's actually less problematic in many ways if we think about the real world. Municipalities are particularly interesting in terms of zoning and you know, what is surprising, given that we think private property is this sort of sacred right. It's actually surprising how much municipalities, at least my side of the 49th parallel, maybe less so where you are, but we're used to municipalities telling you can't tear a building down because it's got a heritage designation, for example, or that you have to do, you can't go over this height, or that so there's lots of ways in which we think that cities have to be designed with human well-being in mind.
Yeah, even in the United States, there's plenty of that.
Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah. That's a big sort of subsection of arguments people have about, you know, making more housing available and stuff like that is exactly those sorts of considerations. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Well, do you want to start taking questions?
Sure, good idea.
Great, thank you so much. I mean, there've been a number of questions coming in. I think it's fair to say that Debbie's question's already been answered, because I think she sent it before Ben brought up the issue of flourishing. So she was asking, how broad is your conception of flourishing? So I think that was definitely addressed. So there's a question that came in quite early on from Dave, who asks, should, in capital letters, there be, as opposed to is there, any relationship between outcomes and inputs, e.g. productive contribution? So Christine, do you want to go first? And then Ben, if you want to follow up or comment on this question at all, then please do so. Otherwise, we'll move to the next one.
Yeah, thanks. That's an excellent question. Very good, pointed way of putting the issue. I mean, these things will be context relative potentially, but there's certainly a whole swath of things that we just think that your contribution cannot determine how much you have in the way of healthcare or education or whatever, right? So that's why we have those are things that are publicly provided, and public goods are particularly valuable, right? It's goods that you get just by being a member of a society, being a member of a political community, rather than goods that have some kind of user pay dimension to them, or even a needs base. Sometimes we think that in order to meet people's needs adequately, we need to have goods that are provided to everyone, even those who privately could have afforded to get them for themselves. And that's a way of ensuring that everyone has the same level of need satisfaction, and that everyone's equally committed to the provision of those goods and so forth. So I would like to know what kind of context one thinks that one's input should determine how much one has. I guess my socialist inclinations tell on this, in that I think that people should have their needs met, and that's the criterion that we should be using, rather than how much they contribute. We could decide that we want to incentivize people, and that was certainly the kind of thing that Rawls said. But I think people to the left of Rawls said that, well, this was just a betrayal of the commitment to the egalitarian ideal, where it's arbitrary that some people are able to contribute more than others. That's a matter of brute luck or circumstance. Even the ability to work hard, one could argue, is something that we might not think is a matter of sort of moral merit. So I'm very reluctant to tie what one has to what one contributes.
Yeah, I mean, I do wonder, that if there is about that last distinction, because certainly, I mean, in a certain sense, I mean, again, I mean, Marx and the Critique of the Gotha program, where he says the thing about, from each according to your abilities to each according to your needs, is willing to accept, at least temporarily, some tying of outputs to inputs to incentivize production. Even Jacobin, I think, read closely, like, sort of grudgingly accepts that, as a, I mean, of course, he's in the category of people you're criticizing, but, just as a person to the left of Rawls. But yeah, I mean, I think that, I guess I'm sort of inclined to be a little bit of a squishy centrist about this, to say that, like, on the one hand, I think that there is something that seems a bit less objectionable to me about inequality that is purely a matter of how much somebody chose to contribute. And I know that word "chose" is a minefield, but but at the same time, I mean, look, if you get to a point in terms of technological progress and the social institutions that you have governing how that the bounty of that progress is captured and distributed, where you don't have to tie outputs to inputs. I mean, that does seem like that. That does seem obviously more desirable to me. That if nobody is being hurt, if you're not having, the economy is not collapsing, etc., as a result of not having to tie these things together, then that does sound like a much better society to me.
Thank you. Christine, was there anything you wanted to respond to in Ben's point, or would you like to move on to the next question?
Yeah, no, I think we're kind of coming to some sort of agreement here. It's interesting that it was Stalin who said, "Those who do not work do not eat," and it seems a kind of sad comment that egalitarianism seems to be reduced to the terms of competition for scarce resources and positions. That just contrary to the spirit of solidarity and comradeship that I think egalitarianism really ought to be premised on.
Thank you. So Brooks asked a question which I think many people in Europe would probably resonate with. It's shock over certain patterns of behavior in the US. In this case, Brooke picks up on watching a PBS NewsHour coverage about school lunch issue in the US when children who can't pay for their school meals are refused food in front of their better heeled comrades. What is the justification for this kind of discrimination, which seems so incredible to those of us who live in Europe? I remember thinking in a similar vein when I moved to the United States last year. My wife was trying to talk me through the ways in which the justifications for the healthcare system, as I suppose have been brought up in a country that takes it for granted. And so I suppose maybe there are certain deeper assumptions or theories that are at play here, and I think Brooke wants to maybe understand how something like that can happen in a school in America.
Well, luckily I don't have to speak for America, nor does Ben for that matter. but here I am in Canada. It's unconscionable. There is no justification. Basically, I think. I mean, some idea that you're responsible for prudent management of the household budget and blah blah blah. But I think probably the strongest case for any egalitarian position is children, right? So we know that even like egalitarians, and John Romer says this very boldly, will say, well, of course, children are another case. We don't think children are making choices and decisions, with any kind of criterion of responsible, prudent decision making. That's just totally unjust to apply that any kind of luck egalitarian structure to the decision making of children. So whatever you think is the reason why adults are disadvantaged, it's unjust to apply it to children. So I think that, and that actually it's the idea of the injustice of being born to one family rather than another in terms of socioeconomic status, but a whole bunch of things, whether they're good parents and so forth, whether they are sensible, practical, rational people, etc. That just makes it so vividly obvious that inequality is unfair. So I'm sympathetic to the tone of that question, which is basically that one cannot justify it.
Yeah. I mean, I actually remember growing up, I was certainly in a school district that didn't practice that particular kind of, hadn't entered the new frontier of social cruelty that the questioner is referring to, which I have heard about a bit. But the relatively far more benign thing that I remember is standing in line for school lunch and having them ask everybody, "Oh, are you on free or reduced lunch?" And so I guess some people qualified for free school lunch or for like some sort of discount, and I remember even that used to really bother me because you're asking people to to say publicly, like while they're in line and in front of their classmates, that what essentially what their family's income level is, which seems sort of objectionable enough, in and of itself, and this is, I guess, maybe just to briefly tie it to larger questions at issue here. I mean, of course, this example, as you say, because it's about children, it's one where I think even people who feel the pull of saying, okay, adults can be held responsible for various decisions, whatever. It's even in those terms, you couldn't possibly justify this, but it's also there is a sort of way that there is a slippery spectrum of indignities that are tied to this, that that even if they aren't necessarily about children directly. So I remember, for example, reading an essay, it was published after his death in Jacobin, called "The War on the Poor Must End," I think, by my late friend Michael Brooks, who was recounting going grocery shopping with his mom when she was using a SNAP card, which is what people are thinking of when they use the term food stamps, even though it's a card, and having her sort of like look both ways to see who was around and watching when she would pull it out, and being like very keenly aware of that as a little kid. So I mean, this is something that's, even things that don't directly target children, certainly children aren't immune from the parallel indignities. And this is, I think this is one reason why one of the things that motivates the idea in the Cohen essay that Christine mentioned earlier, that even if you think that sort of inequalities are only objectively unjust in a certain way, if they're tied to things beyond your control, that you'd also have something like a value of community, where you say, well, if people are within your sphere of concern, there's a certain level that you're not going to let them fall behind. I mean, any more than you would like let a member of your family fall below that level.
Thank you, Christine. Would you like to respond to anything Ben just said?
No, that's fine. Thanks.
Okay, so we're pretty close to the end. So I thought I'd ask you a question which I imagine would have a reasonably short answer to it. So Christine, well, thank you so much for your rich thoughts. Christine, do you feel, this is from Alice, by the way, do you feel that you need to underpin your ideas with a metaphysical picture related to free will, responsibility, etc., or can your political theory operate without this kind of foundational work?
That's a great question. Yeah, and I sort of say, well, let alone that morass over there on these questions, which certainly makes it a problem whether or not we freely choose the paths in life that we end up traversing. We can restrict our discussion to the political and say we know enough about the socioeconomic factors of what goes into why one person's life goes one way and another person's life goes another way, to problematize at least that distinction between choice and circumstance. And I guess we also just know in a sort of everyday, mundane, commonsensical way that some people just seem to know how to get to the door, know how to open it, know how to go from that door to another door that will be, and it will be there open for them. And others just don't seem to get it together to do that. And it seems wrong to think of that as a kind of culpability rather than something that society should try to attend to and remedy.
Thank you, Ben. I noticed something on your Substack when I was looking through it quite recently. It was called something like you can be a lefty while still believing in free will or something. So obviously you're kind of engaging with the free will question in the context of politics.
Yeah, that was called How to Be a Leftist Without Being a Utilitarian or a Free Will Skeptic. And I was right on the edge of thinking, it's like, maybe I said a lot of philosophy, maybe I should just refer people to the existence of that essay and leave it at that. But I guess maybe the one thing I would add is just that, I think there is a sort of certain way of accepting, like, that there's something desirable about not wanting to let your answers to these questions rest on sort of controversial, positions on deep and difficult questions like this. And I definitely see that impulse. I would point out that social change is really, really hard, and it takes a really long time, and that there are so many inequalities in the world around us that are so obviously and sort of uncontroversially tied to factors outside of our control that you could have that you could spend quite a long time addressing all of those, and you'd have to create like a really unfathomably different, sort of advanced socialist society, just to address those. And before you are really faced with the question of, okay, what's left that plausibly might be seen as under anybody's control, and then we really have to answer this deep metaphysical question.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the same time, people, how one lives one's own life is obviously with a sense of taking charge of it. So there's a difference between a political outlook of generosity and fellow feeling and attending to the shortfalls and well-being of our fellows, and the way in which one ought to live one's life in terms of doing what you can to pursue your projects and goals and taking responsibility as best you can. That's just how to be a human, I think.
All right. It's Christine Sypnowich. You can read her essay in Boston Review. It's in the new print issue, but is also online. And if you go to my Substack, benburgis.substack.com, there is an essay that is up there right now that's kind of reflecting on my conversation with Christine and the sort of larger issue of her view and Jacobin's radical socialist version of egalitarianism, and what there kind of might be to her critique, and then like even after you absorb that, what there might be that Cohen gets right, and so people can check that out there. But and before I leave, I do want to really quickly plug for our graphic designer Andy on his other podcast, the podcast that he co-hosts, Movie Night Extravaganza. They're doing in a week from tomorrow. They're doing a live show at Sanger Hall in New York. So do check that out if you're so inclined, if you're around, and also if you want to take the class that I'm teaching on Marx and Proudhon, where we read Proudhon's Philosophy of Poverty and Marx's response, the Poverty of Philosophy. We just started that, so we kind of did an introductory meeting. But if you want to join the class before we start Chapter 1 on Sunday, just go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis, and even if you're already a patron, just go to the membership tiers and just go up to the thing to take the class. And if you are not a patron, you should become one, most importantly, because it's an expression of solidarity and it helps us keep going what we're doing on the show. So if you value this work and you want to keep going, that's a great way to do it. But also, because you're a patron, you get the postgames after every regular Monday night episode. So we are about to go to one of those right now with Zac and Gavin from the Vanguard. If you're a patron, you should already have an email, or go to the Patreon, you should see it. If you are not a patron, no time like the present. So you have to check that out for sure. And we're going to be starting that, in the next minute or so after we're done here. So if you're a patron, I will see you in just a minute. If you're not a patron, well, I won't see you next week because I'm actually going to be gone next week. But our good friend Jason Miles from This Is Revolution is going to be guest hosting next Monday. So do check that out. Left is best.